number and you don't need an ITIN. But if you have a federal or a state filing requirement, you will need either the Social Security number or the ITIN. So the next thing we look at then is your spouse and how they should be treated when it comes to tax. So the IRS are pretty stringent on how your spouse and dependents should be treated. So if they've never worked at all, they've no income, they'd still need to complete the Form 8843, similar to you. But if they have had income, then they will trigger a federal filing requirement. And also if they're in a state where there's state tax, they may also trigger a state filing requirement. So they basically have the same rules as you, the visa holder. FICA taxes then. So if you're in the US at the age of 65 and you need assistance in paying your medical bills, FICA tax would assist you with that. But the thinking is that as a non-resident international student, the chances are you're probably not going to be in the US at the age of 65. And for that reason, there's a general rule that if you're on a J1 or F1 visa, you're exempt from paying FICA taxes. But in a lot of cases, if you're working off campus, your employer may not know this, so they may treat you the same as a resident who would need to pay FICA taxes. So the best thing to do here is to check your W-2. There is a section on there saying FICA or Social Security, and if tax has been withheld, and if you're on one of these visa types, then you should firstly ask your employer for a refund. But if they're not willing to issue a refund, then definitely submit a FICA return through Tax via Form 843 or 8316, because you will get all of that back. So I mentioned briefly an ITIN or individual taxpayer identification number just a minute ago. So just going to go into it in a little more detail here. So an ITIN essentially applies to those students who have a filing requirement, whether that be federal or state, but are not eligible to work in the US. So who might that be? Well, let's go back to that sports scholarship. So you might not be eligible to work in the US, but because your scholarship is considered income, so if it was covering anything outside of tuition or tuition related expenses, it's considered income, then you would trigger a federal filing requirement, and in that case, you'd need to apply for an ITIN. If you have a Social Security number, you don't need an ITIN. So it's just for those who have a filing requirement but are not eligible to work. So next we have the Form 1098T, and this is a really important slide because it's the #1 form of misfiling every year for non-residents. Form 1098T applies only to residents, and it's an educational tax credit. So if you were to go to a website that prepares taxes for residents and you say you've received a 1098T or you've received one from your college in error, you could get a $1,000 tax credit. But as a non-resident, you're not entitled to receive this. And if the IRS realise that you've claimed this tax credit, not only will they look for that $1,000 back, but they could also apply fees and penalties, and interest can accrue on that. So just be really careful of that. Form 1098T applies only to residents and should not be included in your tax return. Similarly, Form 1095 A, B and C series are documents relating to how you would have received your healthcare. But again, as a non-resident, if you've received these documents, you can't use them towards your tax return. So I'd say just file them away, put them somewhere safe for your own personal use. They're not to be included on your tax return. State taxes then. I mentioned a little while back just the difference, I suppose. Some states do have state tax, other states don't. So, you know, they vary from state to state. Some states can have quite high state tax where others have no state tax at all. Again, that's something that you don't need to worry about. You don't need to worry about the calculations and whether you need to do a state return or not. The logic in the Sprint tax software will work that out for you. So once you enter your details throughout that questionnaire, we'll use the information to determine your filing requirements, and we'll work out whether you've got a state filing requirement or maybe multiple state filing requirements depending on your circumstances. So if you're listening to this webinar today and you're thinking, okay, well, I've been in the US the last number of years and I've never filed anything at all, or else I filed last year, but I filed as a resident and I filed incorrectly. First things first is don't worry. You're not the only one. There are plenty of students in the same situation. There's always a way to right your mistake. So I'd say if you've never filed at all, definitely catch up. And on the Sprintax website, you can catch up for the last 3 years. The IRS will actually issue a refund if you are due one in those last 3 years. But I suppose on the other side of it, if you owe money to the IRS, there's no cut-off point, and they will expect you to go back as far as necessary if it's a case you owe them money. Also, if you've misfiled or you filed as a resident, you may have claimed that educational tax credit I mentioned and now maybe also received that stimulus check. You would need to complete a correct non-resident tax return for the year or years that you've incorrectly filed, and you'll also need to complete an amended US tax return, so Form 1040X. And by submitting both of these documents to the IRS, you can right the mistake from your misfiled return. We'll also cover this in a little more detail later, on what you need to do if you've received that stimulus check in error. But as I mentioned earlier, we do have that discount code, so $20 discount code on the amended returns. If there is anyone here today who has submitted a return in error, submitted a resident return, and now needs to submit a corrected and amended return, definitely use that code, and Neil has put that in there for you. So what are the actual implications then of not filing? So first is if you owe money to the IRS, there's a high chance that they will apply fees and penalties, and interest can accrue on that. But I'd say the most important reason is the immigration aspect. So if you were to apply for a H-1B or a green card in the future and you don't have your taxes up to date, there's a very high chance that the H-1B or the green card won't be approved. So it's a big reason and a big incentive to ensure that your taxes are 100% caught up for every year that you've been in the US. The final reason then is that in a lot of cases, you'll actually receive a refund back. So it's a big incentive to go in and see what you may be due. Obviously, as I mentioned, it is part of your visa conditions. It's something that you absolutely need to do, but more often than not, there's also a financial incentive there. So definitely worth doing it for that alone. So the final slide then on the tax principles section is tax scams. And we do need to mention this because we do so many workshops every year, and every year the tax scams are becoming more elaborate for international students. So just to give you an example, we were at a workshop last year and we spoke to a student who had been subjected to one of these scams. So she'd received a phone call from somebody pretending to be from the IRS, and in her own words, they had a really convincible argument. They'd obviously checked out her social media because they knew where she was from, where she worked during the year, what she was studying, and they managed to convince her that she owed $4,000 in taxes to the IRS. Now, the student didn't have that kind of money and she panicked. So she agreed to get into an Uber that was arranged by the person on the phone. She agreed to go to her local Apple store where she purchased $1,000 worth of Apple vouchers. That's all she had at the time. And then she gave the number on the back of the voucher to the person on the phone. Now, I know you're probably sitting there thinking, no way, it had never happened to me, but just be so careful. They are becoming more sophisticated each year. But I suppose the important thing to know is that the IRS will never contact you through email and they'll never phone you. If they want to get in touch with you, they'll send you a letter in the mail. And they're a very fair organisation. So if they do send you out a letter, they'll give you 2 weeks to respond. So if anybody does contact you asking for you to transfer large sums of money in a short space of time, then I'd say it's definitely a scam. So, obviously the usual advice, don't click on any links, delete the email, maybe let your international office know as well so that they can let the international student population know that this is something that's maybe circulating. So we'll have a look then at the stimulus payment and whether, who is entitled to receive it, who's not entitled to receive it, and what you need to do if you've received that in error. So Neil, I might let you take over from here for a minute just to give everyone a break from me, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, sounds good.
Great, thank you.
So you've probably heard a lot about this in the news, or maybe your friends have been talking about it, but we're going to give an overview of the economic impact payment, which is basically that COVID-19 payment that you might have heard about. So we'll first start with who's actually eligible for that payment. Well, really, it's really just for US residents for tax purposes. So anything outside of that, you would not be eligible for the payment. Now, if you are a US resident for tax purposes, you also may not be eligible for it, because it really does depend on the actual income that you've received over the last, either in 2018 or 2019. So if you did find that you are a US resident for tax purposes and you made under 75,000 as an individual, or under 112,000 as a head of household, or under 150,000 as a married couple filing jointly, then you'll receive the full payment, which is $1,200. If you earned over that slightly, so if you earned under $1,000, or if you earned under $136,000 as a head of household, or under $198,000 as a married couple filing jointly, then you'll receive a smaller amount, but you may still be eligible for some payment. But again, that's really only eligible for US residents for tax purposes. So who is not eligible then? And this is probably more relevant to the people on this call. So really, if you earn over any of those thresholds that I just mentioned, you're not eligible. If you don't have a social security number, you're not eligible. But more importantly, if you're a non-resident alien for tax purposes, you're not eligible to receive that payment, which I imagine most people on this webinar would be considered a non-resident alien. Now just remember, if you want to determine whether you're a non-resident alien or a resident alien, the best way to do it is to determine whether you meet that substantial presence test that Elvira mentioned a while ago. And the best way to do that is to fill out the first section on Sprint tax. That's section 1. And once you give us your entry and exit dates, if you are a resident, we'll tell you right away. And if you're a non-resident, we'll let you proceed on to the next step and the next step. So have a look at that if you're not too sure. But really, as an F1 student, if you're here under 5 years, generally you're considered a non-resident for tax purposes. Now that's normally all pretty straightforward, but unfortunately we've seen thousands of students file incorrectly in previous years and therefore receive the stimulus payment check in error. So if you filed as a resident in error, so for instance you might have used TurboTax, and just remember, like Elvira said, TurboTax is a software only for residents. So if you're a non-resident and you use TurboTax, you're creating, first of all, you're preparing incorrect tax documents, which are, the incorrect documents are Form 1040. They're the resident documents. If you're a non-resident, you should be submitting Form 1040NR. So if you have submitted an incorrect tax document with TurboTax in past years, you've basically submitted incorrect figures to the IRS. And in some ways, it's a fraudulent tax return. You've been given tax credits that you're not entitled to. So you might have got a higher tax return. You might have been given credits on your education, which you're not entitled to. And that, that's technically considered tax fraud. So if you've done that, there's a high chance that you might also have received the economic impact payment in error. And again, it's adding to that. So make sure if any of that has happened, you correct that mistake. And again, you can always submit an amended tax return online via Sprint Tax. We'll assist you with that. We'll prepare a correct 1040 NR, and we'll also prepare a correct 1040X. And if you are doing that, just make sure to look in the chat button, the chat function of this. We have a code in there. And I'm going to resend that code for anyone that might need it. And it's all capitals, amend 19N20. So use that code, it'll give you $20 off. But just make sure you are correcting your incorrect tax return if you have submitted an incorrect tax return. And it's a common mistake, but it's really important that you do correct it at this stage. If you go for a H-1B or a green card, it certainly might affect your future visa prospects. So keep on top of it. Resources that are useful to you. On the screen here, there's a couple of IRS Q&As that are quite helpful. And we've also submitted a handout to the webinar software. So if you look in the handout section now, you'll see there is a document called Sprint Tax Webinar Handout. So there we'll give you a link to our Sprint Tax blogs, which will give you a step-by-step guide on how to amend your tax return. We'll give you our information session on how to hand back the actual stimulus payment, and then we'll also give you some useful links to IRS websites. So do have a look at that. So I'd be really interested to know, just in terms of anybody on this session, anybody that you might have known, have you or someone you know received the stimulus or the CARES Act payment in error? And I'm going to submit a poll, and it's really just so that we can see who's on the call and we can assist accordingly. So I'm going to share and launch a poll now.
Great, thanks a million, guys. Great to see so many of you answering that for us, and interesting to see the figures there. Neil will share them in just a second, but 15% of you here today have either received that stimulus payment in error yourselves, or you know somebody that has received it. So, you know, it's kind of in line with what we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks in our webinars, you know, in and around the same figures, but just goes to show, you know, there are so many out there who need to submit a correct non-resident tax return with the amended return, and also to return that stimulus check. So do certainly have a look at the handout Neil mentioned there in the handout section. There are some really useful links and information regarding the blog posts and so on in there. But do also use that code that Neil has put into the chat. If you do need to submit an amended return, or you have a friend that needs to do it, do certainly take that code and pass it along to them. But I suppose then, just to have a look at the Sprint Tax software itself, just to kind of guide you through the process if you haven't done it already, what to expect. So at this stage, you should have all received an email from your international office, and in that email there will be a registration link, and you'll also have the code. So obviously this is just an example code, but you'll all have a unique code for your school in that email. So if you just click on the link in the email, it'll bring you straight to the Sprint Tax login page. So if you've used Sprint Tax in the past, it's just a case of clicking on the login button on the top right. But if it's your first time using Sprint Tax, it's just a case of creating my account. And it's really straightforward. It'll ask for your first name, your last name, your email address, your contact number, and to create a password. You're straight in then to the questionnaire. And as we mentioned, the first thing we'll always determine is your residency status for tax purposes. So we'll ask you things like, have you been a US citizen by birth or naturalization on the last day of 2019? Have you ever been a green card holder? We'll ask you for your entry and exit dates, your visa type, and we'll work out then whether you pass that substantial presence test or not. So if it turns out here that you are actually resident for tax purposes, we'll stop you. We won't let you go through and complete an incorrect tax return. We'll stop you and let you know, okay, looks like you're resident for tax purposes, you'd need to use a resident provider. But if you're non-resident, you will proceed on then through the next steps. So the income section then, we will ask you, you know, have you received income in the US? How many employers have you worked for? And based on the information you've provided us, we'll give you a blank income document for each income document you say you've received. So say, for example, you've worked for 2 employers, you've got 2 W-2s, we'll give you 2 blank W-2 documents here. So it's just a case of transferring your information word for word, number for number, from your document onto the blank document here on Sprint Tax. But also worth mentioning while we're on this screen, you'll see Got a Question has popped up. So Sprint Tax offer 24/7 live chat assistance during filing season. Now you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen here, and on every screen throughout the Sprint Tax questionnaire, you've got that Get Help section. So we have the bank of frequently asked questions, but we also have Ask Stacey, which is the live chat. Also, I suppose if you've been on a page for more than 30 seconds and haven't entered any information, the Got a Question box will pop up. So it's just to prompt you and see, you know, do you need some assistance with this? So please do use that. You know, it's a really useful resource. The team are ready and waiting to answer any questions that you have along the way. So I suppose I know things are much harder now that everybody is studying remotely. A lot of you have probably gone back to your home countries, so it's not as easy to pop into the international office with your queries. So we would suggest using this, and we'd always suggest using this. You know, you'll get your questions quicker than stopping and going looking for the answers elsewhere. Also, in the income section, if you have income that's not reported, you know, on an income document, this is where you'd report that. So did you receive any other income from US sources not reported on the W-2, the 1042S, or any other payment documents? This is where you would report that. So for example, if you were a musician and you've played a gig in your local bar and you've earned $200, this is where you'd report that income. State taxes then, as I mentioned, you know, some states have state tax, other states don't have state tax. We will work that out for you. So based on the information you provide here, we'll work out whether you've got a state filing requirement or maybe multiple state filing requirements. So we'll ask you details like your entry and exit date, the state you lived in, the type of accommodation you lived in, and we'll work out then what your requirements are. Onto the review your order section then. You've done the hard work, you've entered all your information, and in this example the student has the federal and the state, a New York state return. Now, also worth mentioning that you're not obliged to use Sprintax to do your state return. You know, just because you've got a code from your school to cover your federal, you're not obliged to use Sprintax for state if you don't want to. You know, if you have another way of doing that offline or whatever, that's absolutely fine. You can just untake that in the previous screen and it won't be added to your checkout. But I suppose at this stage, what you would do is you copy the code from the email that you will have received from your international office, or if it's an amended return that you're doing, copy the code that Neil has put in the chat box in here and click validate, and that will, you know, in the case of the amended return, it'll offer the discount of $20. If it's a case you're entering the code from your school, it'll remove the cost of your federal return, and you then would just pay for any additional services like the state return if you needed Sprintax assistance with that. So the code will either remove the cost of your federal or your Form 8843, or in the case of the amended code, it's the $20 discount on the amended return. So once you've done that, then it's just a case of downloading your documents. You do need to print them, sign them, and physically mail them then to the IRS or the relevant state authority. Now, we will provide you with the detailed description of what you need to do next. But the really important point is that they do still physically need to be mailed to the IRS or the relevant state authority. Unfortunately, there's very limited circumstances where you could submit where you could e-file. It is something that hopefully will be available in the near future, but for the moment you do still physically need to mail those documents. But this is an example of what you'll be presented with once you download those documents. So on the left-hand side, you'll see your summary or instruction sheet. So we'll tell you, okay, you need to print this document, you need to sign it on such a page, such a section. We'll tell you where to mail it to, and we'll provide you with the address that you need to mail it to. So read that instruction or summary sheet, really important to follow the instructions there and get that sent off. But I suppose at that point, you've done everything, you've completed your tax obligations. There's nothing more for you to do at this point, only wait for your refund to come through if you are due a refund. So suppose just have a look at the stats so far this season. So this is the students that have already submitted their federal and their state returns through Sprintax this season. So on the federal side, 76% of students were due a federal refund with the average refund of $1,185, which is up on last year, which is great to see. It was about $1,045 last year, so it's up over $100 on last year's figure. On the state side then, 68% of students were due state refunds with the average of $501. Again, slightly up on last year's figure. So great to see students receiving those kind of refunds back. As I mentioned earlier, it is an obligation. You do have to submit your returns. It's part of your visa conditions. But look at the refunds you may well be due as well. And the only way you'll get this back is by submitting your tax return. Just an overview then of Sprintax so far this season. We've prepared over 100,000 tax returns, And we've prepared over 3,000 amended returns so far this year. Now, I suppose just to give a little context on that, last season we would have prepared about 300 amended returns throughout the whole season. At this season so far, it's 3,000 amended returns, and that number has grown daily. So just goes to show, you know, with the stimulus payment going out and people realizing that they've submitted these resident returns in error, there are so many students that need to correct that. So do certainly, if you have received that in error, do correct it, set the record straight, get your non-resident tax return submitted with your amended return, and get that stimulus payment sent back. But I suppose that's it. That's the whirlwind view of Sprintax and how it works and how we can help. But we'd be happy to open up to any questions that you may have now. I know Neil has probably been in the chat box answering some questions there along the way, but we'll pop in and see, you know, what's left there, or what I suppose the frequently asked or the more common questions are coming through there. So let's have a look. Okay, let's see. Second now.
If you want, Elvira, I can jump on with 2 questions and then we might do it that way.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, Neil, sorry, I want to just go through here and find. Thanks a million.
So the first question, for GAs who get a tuition fee waiver, do we get a 1042S? So if that waiver basically just covers your tuition, then no, you won't get a 1042S. You'll only get a 1042S if that waiver covers areas outside of tuition. And another question, do I need to file anything but Form 8843 if I have not earned anything in the US? So if you've earned no US income, then it sounds like you just need to do Form 8843. Now, I will say we can only go by what you're telling us here, and obviously you can only tell us so much in the chat function. So we won't be able to, you know, accurately tell you what the exact forms are that you'll need until you go on to Sprintax, until you fill out the online questionnaire. And once you've filled out that questionnaire, the software will advise you what forms you need. And it will prepare either your 8843 or your federal or your state. So just remember that.
Great, thanks, Neil. And questions there asking if you'll receive the PowerPoint later after the webinar. So yeah, like the session is being recorded. So what we'll do is we'll email all attendees later with the link to the recorded webinar. So you'll be able to go back and review that or listen back on it. So yeah, that will go out to you later on this evening. Another question there, I'm an international student. If I wasn't in the US last year because I was abroad for the entire year, do I need to fill out Form 8843? So I suppose if you weren't in the US in 2019, then no, you wouldn't need to submit anything for that year. But if you spent any time in 2019 in the US, so if you left maybe in January or whatever, you spent a couple of days in the US at the beginning of the year or any time in the year, then you would need to submit the Form 8843. But if you weren't physically in the US in 2019, in that calendar year, then no, you won't need to submit anything there.
Okay, so next question. For the amended return, okay, so yes, someone's asking me what the discount is for the amended return. So it's $20. So that'll provide you with the discount to check out. And another question, how can we receive info from the IRS if we're abroad? I cancelled my lease, so I don't even have a mailing address in the US anymore. That's a tough one. In that case, if it's a state return, in a lot of cases, there might be a state return platform that you can use, and you can reach out to them via phone, depending on what state you're in. And then if you're looking for the actual IRS for your federal return, you can try call them. At the moment, I imagine they're quite busy, but it's really the best way to try and contact them.
Thanks, Neil. Another one then just on the scholarship. So my scholarship covers more than just tuition, but my college says that I won't receive a 1042S. Is that possible? So if your scholarship covers more than tuition, then you should receive that 1042S. Do you know, it would give details of the amounts and so on. So you would need that in that case. If your scholarship covers just tuition, so nothing outside of tuition, if it just covers your tuition, then you probably won't receive that and it's not an issue. But if it does cover anything outside of tuition, you would expect to receive that. So I'd maybe go back to them and see if you can get a copy of that. Just request it from them. I'm sure they'll issue that.
Okay, next two questions then. This is a good one. Someone said, I'm outside the US. Sprintax asked for a US bank account, which I don't have. How can I transfer my tax return to my bank account in my home country? So if you don't have a bank account, like many students who've left the US, they'll close their account. You can use a money transfer provider. So we partnered with TransferWise. So on the section where we ask, do you have a bank account? You'll see the option for TransferWise. And it's basically an online account. Now we're not affiliated with them. We're just providing them as an option. But you can go on, you can register an account, and the IRS will submit your tax return directly into your TransferWise account, and then you can transfer that back to your home country account. So that should be useful enough in this situation.
Great.
And the next question.
Sorry, Nick, go on. Yeah.
And the next question then was, where can I find my Form 8843? I'm currently outside the country in India. Does the postmark date have to be July the 15th as well? So for this, your 8843 will be prepared by Sprintax. So you can find it online once you fill out the questionnaire. And in terms of getting that document to the IRS, I would say, it's definitely important to aim to have it with the IRS for July the 15th. If it's a few days late, it's not the end of the world. But, just for yourself, I try to do it as soon as possible and send it. You do still have a month. So I'm hoping you still have plenty of time.
Great, thanks, Neil. So I have two questions here then, kind of similar. So started working on campus in August, but I haven't received a W-2. Is that normal? So you should have received a W-2 at this point. So I would reach out in that case to your college and ask them for that. Reach out to the payroll department. They should be able to issue that for you. But another one here is then, what should I do if I had an on-campus job? So again, the same sort of thing, you should have received a W-2 at this point. If you had an on-campus job in 2019, you should have received the W-2 by now. But if not, do certainly reach out to the school and request that. They'll be able to issue that over to you. You will need the W-2.
Great. Next question then, and I'll actually do two questions that are very similar. First one is, I'm still a bit confused if the check I received is an error or not. And the next question is, if I'm confident in my resident status for tax purposes, can I assume that I have correctly received the stimulus check? So for both, it really depends, if you're a resident or not. So I would say go into Sprintax, fill out the first section where we ask you for your entry and exit dates. And once you've entered in that information, we'll advise you if you're a resident or not. So if you're allowed to proceed on to step 2, you're a non-resident. And if you're found to be a resident, then it's likely you received the payment in error, so it should be fine. But make sure if you're found to be a non-resident, so we let you move on to step 2, and you receive that stimulus payment, it basically means you've submitted an incorrect tax return last year. So you probably submitted Form 1040, and you might have used a software provider like TurboTax. So it's very easy to fix. Don't worry too much about it, but worry enough that you fix it as soon as possible. And you could do that via Sprintax via the amended return portal.
Great. So another one here, I haven't filed tax returns in past years. Can I still file this year? So yeah, absolutely. But I would say catch up. If you've been in the US the last couple of years and haven't filed anything, do catch up. And you can do that with Sprintax for the last 3 years. So do certainly catch up on those. It may be a case that, you might have been in the US, you might not have worked or earned income, you mightn't have received a taxable scholarship. It could be just the Form 8843 you need to submit, but I'd still do that, certainly catch up and get those done. Another question here then, I filed and signed my form 8843 in March, but could not send it then because of COVID. I plan to send